Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Peter Boekke. Hello, Peter. How are you doing?
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, Peter. Are you still at George Mason?
I am. I'm at my house, but I am my university affiliation is George Mason University, yes.
Peter, are you the head of department?
No, I'm not the head of the department, but I direct a research center that's inside the department and the university. So we're associated with the Mercatus Center, but I also have a faculty appointment in the economics department.
All right, Peter. Peter, I love your economists. They're just so interesting. I read Virgil's Story, and there's a young person who did a paper on Botswana, but I can't remember his name at the moment. But you guys
Scott
are,
Scott Scott Bullier.
I know Scott, but he's not Scott. This person is
Oh,
really, really young, younger than Scott. He's not a European. He has a foreign sounding name.
hmm.
He did a recent paper on Botswana like a year or two ago.
Oh, I'll have to I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, it's a young
Yeah,
person.
yeah.
But you're,
Scott did his dissertation. The reason why I mentioned that is Scott was a student of mine, and he did part of his dissertation was on Botswana.
yeah, so I will speak to Scott at another point, but you're economists. They're just so interesting. And I
Yeah,
really like Virgil's Story.
he's very good. I
Yeah,
mean, he's
I want
doing
Virgil's Story on
innovative
the
work.
show.
Yeah, you should get him. I mean, Virgil's doing the innovative work on the intersection between culture and
Yeah.
economics. And his book with our colleague Ginny Choi on do markets corrupt morals is just
Yeah.
fantastic. I can't recommend it highly
Well,
enough.
I sent him a mail. Maybe he's busy, but you should tell him I want Virgil on the show.
Okay, we'll do.
Yes,
We'll do.
yes.
We'll
But
do.
Peter, what
Yep.
is Austrian economics?
Well, I mean, Austrian economics is a tradition in economic scholarship that goes all the way back to Karl Menger, who was at the University of Vienna. And he was just doing economics. But as oftentimes the case with labels, the opponents of the kind of economics that Menger was arguing for in the German language dismissed it as Austrian economics, and then the label stuck, and it now means a set of various different propositions about the way we study the economy, what the sort of methodological, analytical positions in the economic science that are associated with Austrian School of Economics. The most important of those is probably an emphasis on the subjectivity of individuals and their subjective evaluations of goods and services. And so subjectivism is not only about values, but also about costs, also about expectations, and also about knowledge. And so the Austrian school very much approaches economics as a human science, all right, not as a physical science. And that all follows from that idea. So, yeah.
And how important is the entrepreneur in the Austrian framework?
Sure. So the entrepreneur plays the central role because it's the entrepreneur and their perceptions that recognize opportunities for exchange, opportunities for technological innovation. The ultimate resource is the human imagination. And so, one of my favorite books published during the pandemic is a book by Matt Ridley called How Innovation Works. And in it, Ridley has a line. He says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. So just think about that, right? So innovation as the child of freedom. So we have to have the freedom and the elbow room to be able to recognize and think of various creative solutions to the problems around us. And our ability to think creatively and solve problems is what helps us generate wealth creation, which gives us the prosperity. So the child of freedom, because we have the elbow room, and the parent of prosperity, because the consequence of unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit is to realize productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation through exchange.
In other words, we need permissionless innovation.
Exactly. Exactly. And if instead what we relied on is the precautionary principle, we would still not have an airplane and not have all the other kinds of things. So there's a great line in computer science, right, which is it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is permission. And I think that's true of entrepreneurship in general.
And a big impediment to permissionless innovation in the United States is the FDA,
Yeah, well,
the Food and Drugs Administration.
we're seeing that at the moment play out to some extent. The FDA has various strong biases in it to make sure that they don't accept projects that should be rejected. But in a world of scarcity, that also means that what you're doing is not accepting projects that you should have accepted. And so delays and whatnot with regard to innovative therapeutics and have plagued the FDA for decades. Think about beta blockers with respect to heart patients and the delays that were associated, as they kept on running the tests. And today, we still have emergency authorization only for the vaccines, when in fact, we've had tremendous amount of data and what throughout the country and the world actually. And so we're all waiting for full authorization from the FDA, and then that might alleviate some of the hesitancy that people have about the vaccines.
But Peter, innovation is a process of trial and error.
Yeah.
Usually, the first stage of inventing is imperfect, and the FDA has the philosophy of a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats are obsessed with perfection, just like China. So in a recent piece, I argued that a major difference between China and America is that Americans do not have a problem with failing, whereas the Chinese prefer perfection, and innovation is a disruptive process. So until bureaucrats in America and the rest of the world can acknowledge that inventing is imperfect, then bureaucrats will always be a barrier to innovation.
I think that that's a very wise and important insight of yours, and I hope people start to understand it. It's in the technical economics of it. It's the difference between type 1 and type 2 errors, and the bureaucracies are very much biased against a certain type of error, and as a result, they end up by committing the other error all the time. And you can relate it all the way back to the number one rule in economics from Bastiat to Henry Hazlitt, which is the what is seen and what is unseen. And a lot of the hidden costs associated with bureaucracy are in unseen costs. They're not and those are the things that cause the delays in the innovative process that we need to overcome to be able to see our way through to the tremendous opportunities that innovation and entrepreneurship give to us. Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, Maria Mazzucato is an economist. I respect her, but in the arena of innovation economics, some of her arguments are inaccurate. Yeah. The state, based on many studies, usually the state plays a pivotal role in crowding out private investment and innovation. There's a stronger relationship between business expense on R&D and innovation than with state expenditure on R&D and innovation. And Mazzucato is fairly articulate and quite prominent at the moment. People take her seriously, they should, but I fear that developing countries may learn the wrong insights from her.
Sure, I agree with you, and I share that same, frustration. I think Deirdre McCloskey and Alberto Mangari have a book challenging her on each of her claims about the state-led development, but she is the theorist of the moment in a lot of ways, and it's because people are longing for moonshots, right? So they want to see moonshots related to the getting beyond the COVID virus, moonshot related to infrastructure, moonshot related to underdevelopment questions. And what McCloskey and Mangari are pointing out is that, state-sponsored efforts to handle these kind of big investments often lead to boondoggles and waste and crowding out, the things that you were just talking about, as opposed to spurring on entrepreneurial innovation. And so, it's a horse race that's going on, intellectual horse race that's going on between state-led development versus market-driven or, commercial expansion-driven development or trade-tested development. And, I think that the future of economics in many ways will be determined on how we come down on these debates.
But an important takeaway from Mazzucato is that she is actually accurate on the role of small businesses in the economy. Most small businesses fail. According to one British study, 80% of small businesses fail. Therefore, if you are a bureaucrat, you should invest in innovation and not necessarily SMEs. Whereas today, the argument is to invest in small businesses. We contend that small businesses are the engine of growth, but this is not supported by data. So in this arena, she's actually correct.
Well, I think that this is a kind of an intriguing debate about how do we measure entrepreneurship. So there's a thing, an empirical database called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And about 2 decades ago, people started to ask, like, how do we measure entrepreneurship and its role in the economy? And so is that judged by the number of patents? That would be technological innovation. Is that judged by the number of startups, right? Which is new firms entering in. And so you get various different measures. And so think about someone like, Hernando de Soto, right? And what he tried to do was measure the basically the amount of time it took to open up a business in your country. So if it took you 180 days to open up a business, getting licenses and whatnot, that was more cumbersome than if it took you a month to open up a business, right? And so he wanted to measure what it is that was, one of the things he was doing that was impediments to entrepreneurship. He also saw in that impediments in the property rights structure, because we were failing to recognize the informal property rights that existed in many of these countries. And as a result, we ended up by having what he calls in his other book, dead capital as opposed to live capital, because people couldn't collateralize, use as collateral their property because it was informal, didn't have, property rights associated with it. And so his reforms have gone in that direction. That was also a kind of idea that Mansur Olson had when he was working on these issues. She comes from a different school of thought. So she's focusing on, investment levels or big push, to put it another way, or what used to be called high development theory, right? So if you go back in time and you look at people like Albert Hirschman or Rosenstein Rodin or Alexander Gerschenkron, they were looking at this idea of where you could get big push industrialization. And that relied on the state rather than the idea of trade being the pattern that does it. And so again, I think, I hope this translates, but, the basic idea is that we're engaged in an intellectual horse race among different competing hypotheses about what is the source of modern economic growth. And my own view is that the most effective ways to think about modern economic growth come from either people like Nathan Rosenberg and Berzel in their book, How the West Grew Rich, which is about political decentralization and competition among the various different city states. Another one would be Deirdre McCloskey and a change in the rhetoric and the attitudes that we had towards people engaging in the bourgeois virtues as opposed to the warrior virtues or the Christian virtues. We now had the bourgeois virtues, and that is giving it a go in the marketplace was valued rather than shunned and looked down upon. And then finally, Joel Moncur's work.
I love him.
Yeah, so Joel Moncur's work, which looks at the difference between how it is that scientific knowledge gets translated into commercially useful knowledge, and whether or not the headwinds of forces impeding innovation or the tailwinds pushing the innovation forward, which one of those is competing. And I think if you do some kind of combination of Rosenberg, McCloskey, and Moncure, you get a better sense of how it is that we get modern economic growth and how we get a miracle of modern economic growth, more so than the big push stories of previous thinkers in the high development theory or Mariana Masazuki today. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I am a big fan of Joel Moncure. I don't think that there is a more sophisticated writer on the Industrial Revolution alive today.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yes.
I agree with you, and I hope that your listeners just go to YouTube and look up, his speech that he gave on his book, A Culture of Economic Growth. I think it's fantastic. Or his debate with Gordon over, whether or not America is in decline or going forward. And so I think that Moncure has so much to offer, us about how we understand the scientific culture and how it translates into, modern economic growth, technological innovation and improvement.
Yeah, and Joel Moncure as a fascinating piece for Slate MIT review on innovation in the 21st century and why it will not peter out.
Yeah. Yeah, because the tailwinds are pushing faster than the headwinds, and so it's interesting in my own writing, which is separate from this. I have a piece where I use this metaphor of a horse race, but not intellectual horse race. This is a horse race and the economic forces that are pushing us forward, and I contrast a Smithian horse, which is the horse for our trade, right, in globalization and international linkages. And then the other is I call a Schumpeterian horse, and that is innovation and technological breakthroughs. And so you have these two horses, a Smithian horse and a Schumpeterian horse. And then you have a third horse, and that third horse is stupidity. And that's like, government stupidity, where they try to curtail your trade through protectionism or restrictions on immigration and these other things. Or you have fear of technology, increased regulations of innovation and whatnot. And the bottom line is that as long as the Smithian horse and the Schumpeterian horse are running faster than the stupid horse, tomorrow will be better than today, right? Despite a lot of stupidity, we'll still do better. But if somehow the stupid horse outpaces the Schumpeterian or Smithian horse, well, that's when countries decline. That's when you get the decline and the pinch on your progress. And so I think the number one thing that we need to do is make sure that we rein in the stupidity so that it doesn't impinge upon the tremendous gains from trade, from the Smithian recognition of the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, and the tremendous innovations that Schumpeter's talking about, which is the breakthroughs, these technological creative destruction that overturns and revolutionizes the process of production. And so we have to innovation society and the ability of individuals to realize gains from trade.
Let me make a correction. The article was published by Sloan MIT Review, not Slate, but Moncure is also big on the role of the Enlightenment in depleting mercantilism.
Yeah. I think in the culture of economic growth, what he lays out are certain key ideas from the Enlightenment that spread across Europe. McCloskey's idea is that I would see those ideas connected, because it puts a premium on ideas that, the main source of our progress lies in our intellectual revolutions that take place. And I think that that's accurate. And so the connection I would see is between McCloskey affording dignity to the everyday individual and the values of the Enlightenment. And one of the values of the Enlightenment is the recognition of universal human rights. But another key idea of the Enlightenment is the belief in progress, that progress is indeed possible, and it's within our capabilities of realizing that progress. That was a huge shift in humankind, to be able to see that, to recognize the dignity in that we're one another's dignified equals, and that progress in our economic and in our social interactions is indeed possible. And I think that's what Moncure is bringing to the table, as well as McCloskey. And I don't think there's any better work at the moment going on than from those two
I agree.
on that issue.
Yeah, on that issue. But Peter, the idea of progress is central to the rise of the West, as articulated by the late Robert Nisbet, which is often said in 1000 AD, the non-Western world was ahead of the West. But if one has a coherent understanding of Western history and philosophy, then by 1500, we should not be surprised that the West was ahead. The idea of progress was and is central to the West. The Greeks had an idea, but it was really synthesized by Christianity. And by the Enlightenment, Westerners were in a better position to illuminate this idea. So I'm not surprised that the great divergence occurred in the West, because the West seemed to have had a cultural edge.
Well, I think I would slightly, so I agree fundamentally with what you're saying, but I think that part of the issue of the Enlightenment is that it's a promise to all people, not just a particular group of people. It's just that the ideas didn't catch on in some other areas. And that just means, for a variety of reasons, there was resistance. But that doesn't mean that it has to be resistance. So, for example, if you do the thought experiment like you were doing, if you came to the Earth in 1200, the most advanced civilization on Earth would be in China. If you were a Martian and came to Earth in 1400, the most advanced civilization would be in the Islamic Crescent. And the only reason why China didn't continue to evolve and the Islamic Crescent didn't continue to evolve is because of ideas, right? They ended up by closing themselves to these ideas, which were then later developed. I mean, if you go to 1200 and you're a Martian and you look at what's going on in Northwestern Europe, it would be barbaric, right? You would view it as barbaric, what was going on. But yet within 500 years, of course, then, coming out of the Germanic tribes and other kinds of things, you start getting, democracy and recognition of universal rights. And, Hayek has a great chapter in the Constitution of Liberty called The Creative Powers of a Free Civilization. I think one of the key things to recognize is that liberty is won through small victories of accumulating liberties, right? Liberties. So you don't, it's not all at one instance that the Enlightenment had its impact. It begins with things like the Magna Carta. It continues to develop and evolve. You have various different intellectual ideas that evolve over the next following centuries. And then eventually it gets embodied into English common law, the US Constitution, and these other things. But there's no restriction as to why it is that it happened starting in Holland and then translating to the rest of Western Europe and then to the United States that limits it to those groups. It could have happened anywhere had the ideas, and it can still happen to this day. And so, but what happens is that you have to get respect for the core values of the Enlightenment values, the respect of reason and evidence, universal recognition of rights, these kind of things. But then you also have to, recognize the implications of that having to do with private property, freedom of contract, freedom of association, all of these other kinds of ideas that are embedded in these core institutions that allow us to realize productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation.
Exactly. And one must also acknowledge that greater works will be done. So, for example, Joel Moncure often argues that China had a proto-enlightenment movement, but it eventually collapsed.
Yeah.
Whereas in the West, the Enlightenment resulted in the Counter Enlightenment and several other
Yeah,
movements
sure.
that mimicked reason and intellectual development, where the Chinese had a longer history of writing and intellectual assumptions, but
Yeah.
they were unwilling to break from the past. Whereas in the West, we are often told that we build on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that we have in the West, we also have a strong anti-enlightenment trend. This is embedded in the works of people like Rousseau and Marx and Nietzsche, in which they are focused on painting an aesthetic rather than providing an argument based on reason and evidence. Of course, this is an aspect of this is what's picked up by Karl Popper in his The Open Society and Its Enemies, when he decides to criticize, people like Plato or, Marx or Freud. And a lot of it has to do with this idea of this, not comporting with the normal sort of way in which reason and evidence are weighed in argument against free others in free and open discourse. And but those are still so much on the table at the moment for so many intellectuals, that and the way you think about this is whether or not, like, what argument or evidence would ever persuade them to the opposite. So do you see, like, when you were talking to me and you're talking about the Mariana Mazzucchi's idea, you brought up the idea, well, the evidence seems to weigh in her side on this, right? And so then what we have to do is we have to have an argument about the evidence and the logic of the evidence, or like that. But how about if what I said was the picture that Rousseau paints about the noble savage is just a picture, right? It doesn't have any accounting for it in the world. It just is whether or not that's an attractive picture of what it means to then be truly free, or what Marx means by our non-alienated species being, right? And the fulfillment of our species being. These are the kind of issues that then what happens is that we're substituting a aesthetic value for a scientific value, and that has consequences for it. And I think when we think about issues having to do with a lot of the social ills that plague us today, for example, environment or other things, that we have to be, careful to think about how it is that we adjudicate the competing hypotheses, or are we just simply submitting ourselves to a worldview that doesn't have any competing hypotheses to it.
Well,
Right?
what's interesting from your argument is that a premise based on fallacy is still open to logical argumentation. So, for example, the counter-enlightenment movement, in a sense, was anti-reason and pro-reason, because to fashion an argument, one must invoke reason.
Yeah.
So it's a bit contradictory in a sense. They're romantic in a philosophical sense, but not romantic in the normal sense of how we would judge a romantic person who is against reason.
Well, let me push you a little bit on that. McCloskey, in her first volume of the Bourgeois series, has a line in there where she says, you cannot answer empirical questions philosophically.
I agree.
But members of the clerisy, that is the intellectual elite, do it all the time. They do it all the time. I don't want to badmouth a book or whatever, but I just finished reading a book the other day. It has all kinds of claims about the social world in the 20th century related to development economics, economic policy in general, or whatever. You go through that book, there's not a single number in the book. There's no unemployment rate. There's no inflation rates. There's no GDP trends. There's no, resource, utilization trends. There's no quality of the environment or any of those kind of questions like that, let alone economic freedom index or any of these other kinds of ideas. The numbers just simply don't come into play, because the picture that's painted is one that says the only way that you can experience modern economic growth is to have state-led economic development. And if you allow market fundamentalism to dominate, you're going to end up by getting economic growth, but political tyranny. So there's no discussion even of what's happened from globalization, due to the fact that in 2015, for the first time in human history, less than 10% of the world's population was living on less than $2 a day, right? This is just an amazing thing. If you go back to 1990, that 30% of the world's population is living on less than $2 a day. By 2015, all right, less than 10%. It's an amazing miracle of modern economic growth and what all that entails. That's completely absent from the discussion in this book. And a lot of social science is conducted that way because people are convinced very strongly in their priors about what the consequences of markets are, or market liberalization are, for human freedom. And how do you reason with that? That's a tough question. If instead, like McCloskey tries to get them to do, is, oh, you say that the village, in the old days was so wonderful and harmonious. Well, let's go and look. Let's go to the videotape. What do we know about murder rates? What do we know about, like McCloskey gets real about the numbers. And I think that, I'm not saying that all these questions are empirically, that empirics drive everything. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're going to make an empirical claim, you have to actually have some empirical evidence that goes with it. And there's a lot of discussions that take place in which we don't have rational conversations over the empirics. And we should be having that.
Well, responding to such individuals, Peter, is actually quite easy because their moral compunctions are usually wrong. Martin Lewis and Calvin Martin years ago wrote books arguing that hunter-gatherers were never in sync with the environment. On average, they were more likely to pollute the environment than to replenish it. And based on modern research done by people like Virgil Storr, Walter Block, and the Economic Freedom of the World Index family, there's a strong relationship between economic freedom and gender equality, happiness, and even subjective well-being.
Yeah. No, I look, you're not going to get a debate with me on any of that. I think that those explorations of those relationships are fundamental to disabuse people. One of the reasons why I think the Storr and Choi book is so powerful is that they allow, it's the Storr and Choi
the Storr, yes.
Yeah, Storr book does the market corrupt our morals? And the reason why I think that's such a powerful book is because Ginny and Virgil allow the critics of the market their full say, and then they submit the claim to an examination of the counter evidence. And so as a result, they allow the criticisms to be stated in full and in fairness, and then they show them to be wanting. And so that's such a powerful way to learn how to reason against individuals, so that a student reading that can see that you're not like putting your thumb on the scale to start. You're allowing a full and fair hearing, but then you see that the evidence weighs on the side that the market actually improves our morals or makes us more friendly and sociable and all those other reasons.
Yeah, and we have known this since the days of Paul Zak, and when he was really interested in studying the relationship between markets and morals.
Yeah.
Socialistic regimes erect artificial barriers to trade and human sociality.
Yeah,
that's what they do.
Yeah. That's look, I mean, we Paul Zak, did great work on that work, and in his book on morality and markets. But we've known that since Montesquieu and Voltaire and other people about the du commerce thesis, and we've also known about Adam Smith talked about this human sociability and the role that commerce plays in generating that. So these are just well established ideas that need to be restated ever so often because they cut against the intuition of a lot of people.
Civilization endows us with manners. When we have the benefit of luxury, the incentive to engage in illicit activities and to disrespect our colleagues is actually quite low.
Yeah.
Rich people are happy people.
Yeah.
Money can buy experiences, and experiences make us happy. Money.
Well, yeah. I think the ability to we also societies that rely on the pursuit of productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation also are a more cooperative society. They rely on our ability to interact with thousands of people rather than just our intimates, right? This is what Adam Smith is talking about when he says that scarce in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to have but a few close personal friends, but we rely on the cooperation of a great multitude to be able to have our daily food. And that's the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, right, kind of idea that Smith is laying out there. And so Adam Smith's insights into human sociability, I don't know if anyone has really outdistanced them yet. If you combine what's in the theory of moral sentiments, what's also in the Wealth of Nations, Smith, pretty much, it gives us a lot of wisdom to work with. Yeah.
Peter, Smith is a reform version of Bernard. Bernard is a bit tactless, and Smith is the intellectual version who's nice. He's palatable. Deidre McCloskey doesn't like Mandeville at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think because Mandeville seems to focus on prudence only solutions, as Deirdre would put it. But it's useful to work through Mandeville's logic. It's very useful to work through that logic. Yeah.
And Peter, I'm going to introduce a silver bullet in the conversation. It is often said that money does not buy happiness. Poor countries like Jamaica, according to some measures of happiness, tend to score well. The Cato index is more objective, so Jamaica over the years has performed quite poorly on the Cato index. But my response to those who argue that money cannot purchase happiness is this retort. Countries like Jamaica have internalized suffering. This is one reason why they're able to say that they're happy, because they have reconciled happiness with poverty. It is expected that more than likely they may never achieve great success. Middle class living seems far away, therefore one may call himself a sufferer. And I live in Jamaica, and some people actually say I'm a sufferer or I'm suffering. You greet them, how are you doing? And they respond by saying that they're poor and struggling. Such people internalize suffering as a way of life. So obviously they will accept this worldview. Therefore, they're less likely to be unhappy because the standards are lower. Remember, depression in a sense is a function of affluence. Successful societies are likely to produce affluent people. There is a metric of standard. They compare themselves to other individuals who are more successful and may become depressed. But when you're living in a poor country and the stakes are quite low, then you're going to be happy because after a while, you will internalize suffering as a way of life. And I had Eugenio Proto on the show, and he said maybe it's a form of selection. If you're living in a depressed environment and you're serious, that could lead to great calamities. Mm-hmm. So one way to militate against the risk of depression is to internalize suffering and tragedies and be happy.
So my colleague Chris Coyne and I, we wrote a piece many years ago now because happiness indexes were on the rise. And so we wrote a piece, you can get it through IEA in London on happiness. And we provide a criticism of using happiness. And one of them is happiness indexes to guide public policy. But one of them is exactly along your line, which is the elasticity of the concept of happiness, all right, and how that changes over time, and it's not any kind of fixed idea. So, and that has a big impact. It's interesting the way you put it, because if you think about contrasts, let's go back and think about big ideas again, like Weber and the Protestant work ethic, or Rodney Stark and the role that Catholicism,
Christianity.
Christianity, or the role that Catholicism might have played in these things. If you go back and you look at Weber or others who have tried to argue that you needed the Protestant work ethic to get the spirit of entrepreneurship or spirit of enterprise, that's because they thought Catholic ideas, ended up by being anti-growth or whatever. And, Stark, what he's trying to show is that Catholic ideas, in fact, were not anti-growth. And so again, there's something about ideas and the way in which ideas legitimate or delegitimate certain behavioral patterns, which are going to end up by generating the institutions that give us modern economic growth. So, it is ideas matter most, and how we understand those ideas and what they legitimate in terms of our day-to-day practices are going to have a key aspect on whether or not a society is able to overcome any or escape, let's use the phrase escape, from the Malthusian trap and experience modern economic growth. I mean, the great economist Angus Deaton titled his book The Great Escape, because he was talking about how it is that people were able to escape from the miserable battle over resources, right? And experience modern economic growth. So,
Peter, I like to challenge brilliant minds like yourself. This is what you're going to do. You and your smart friends will develop a utility calculus to indicate if it is logical for people in poor countries like Jamaica to internalize calamities as a way to militate against the harsh realities of living in a poor country.
Yeah, well, I could go back to my subjectivism. I'm not sure that I'm able to actually do what you just asked for. I think that might be an impossible task. However, I do think that what we
Nothing is
do,
impossible.
What?
Nothing is impossible.
Not
living to 100 was impossible at one point, but nothing is impossible. We have the internet.
Yeah. But I agree with you. But I do think that there are lessons to be learned from the interrelationship of the stories that we tell about ourselves. So what I would do if I was going to study Jamaica, which I haven't done. Okay.
You should.
If I was going to study Jamaica, and I was going to look to see whether or not it's attitudes in Jamaica that is blocking the ability for entrepreneurship to take place. So the first thing I would want to do is I'd want to look at the various public policies that either cloud our ability to have clear defined property rights that are enforced, and what kind of monetary policies, what kind of fiscal policies, what kind of regulations, what kind of trade policies. So I want to get those off the table. Then the next thing I would do is I would say, okay, so where is the legitimating ideologies coming from? Where would I find them from? And I would look not in any kind of happiness data or anything like that. I would look in literature, indigenous pieces of literature and life stories. So memoirs and biographies of people that grew up in Jamaica, literature about like what it's like to live in Jamaica, those kind of things. Those stories that we tell about ourselves say a lot. The jokes that people tell. I think we should pay a lot more attention as social scientists to the humor that people tell about themselves, rather
You
than
should.
and that we should use that as a source of wisdom for us. So there, when I was a Sovietologist in the first part of my career, that's what I focused on. And there's a Soviet joke. And the Soviet joke, a joke that was told by Russians about themselves, not a joke that someone told about Russians, but a joke that Russians themselves told. And so the joke goes as follows. It says, a genie comes to a Frenchman, an Englishman, and a Russian and says, I'll grant each of you your life wish. What would you like? And so it turns to the Frenchman, and the Frenchman thinks for a second and says, I would like to have many mistresses and a bountiful vineyard. Boom. Transplanted in time to now have a big estate with a bountiful vineyard and many mistresses. The Englishman, what would you like? I would love to have a beautiful cottage overlooking the North Sea. Boom. Off to England to overlook the North Sea and have a beautiful cottage. The Russian is asked. The Russian scratches his beard, says, my neighbor has a goat. I don't have a goat. Kill my neighbor's goat. Okay? Yeah. That attitude that Russian has is a different attitude than what the Frenchman or the Englishman have. The question, I think, is that inherent in being Russian, or is that a product of a feedback loop between institutions that existed in the Slavic countries and the ideas that people had that come out of that existence? So is our ideas like a fly in a bottle, right? So if you have a fly in a small bottle, the fly only develops, a certain type of wingspan. But if you have a fly in a bigger bottle, they'll develop and adapt differently. And so can we actually see this interaction effect between the structure in which people live and the ideas by which they make sense? So the whole play between agency and structure, I think, is what we try to do as social scientists. And it's not limited to, being Russian or being Jamaican. It's that those attitudes are very pliable, or, and they've currently been maladapted to modern economic growth because the structure within which people have operated has not been conducive. And the only way to get out of it is to change the ideas. And so that's why you need intellectual entrepreneurs as well as you need, economic entrepreneurs.
Peter, I'm a Jamaican, so I'll be giving this part of the lesson.
Sure.
Point number one, the economic reform program was sponsored by the IMF. Because of the policies of the IMF, the government was forced to improve the business environment, thereby making it more conducive for private investment. However, the deterrent against real entrepreneurial progress in Jamaica is culture. There is a strong relationship between openness to ideas and innovation, and individualism is the best cultural predictor of long-term economic performance.
Sure.
And on the spectrum, Jamaica is closer to collectivism. Thirdly, envy is negatively correlated with economic growth. And envy is a popular leitmotif that animates dancehall music in Jamaica. In poor countries, people are likely to view successful entrepreneurs with suspicion because the chances of becoming wealthy are low because it's a poor country. So envy is a problem. Thirdly, unnecessary criticisms of appropriate innovations is also a problem. And I have numerous examples. I have read articles in Jamaican publications, and these articles featured innovators, and the comments are negative. People are very skeptical of invention, like it's the medieval ages. So that's a big problem. To really grow, you need to embrace innovation, and American culture is disruptive. So Silicon Valley celebrates failure. Envy is an enormous problem. A perfect example, again, one company in Jamaica is investing in real estate. I am happy because that can create jobs. The bloggers, oh, you're exploiting poor people, mostly nonsense. The Prime Minister even said it in a public comment that they're envious people who will stymie development. So that's a big issue. The IMF program in Jamaica has been successful, but until Jamaicans are able to overcome these cultural hurdles, they're going to go around in circles. And the last point, sentiment. There's a Jamaican company. It's over 90 years old. Relative to companies in the Caribbean, it has done well. But compared to, let's say, a Google or Walmart, it has not done as well because of sentimental policies. This company exports products abroad and actually created a brand in a foreign market. But if you're going to create a brand in a foreign market, do not put Jamaican fried chicken. Put Southern fried chicken because people like similarity. So the company aims to become a multinational, but it keeps saying we're a Jamaican company instead of adapting to the foreign marketplace abroad. Real innovators are a bit unsentimental. So going forward, Jamaican entrepreneurs need to adopt a more realistic perspective in order to tap into foreign markets. Yes, I love Jamaican jerk wings, but if you live in Louisiana, you want to see Louisiana fried wings. That makes sense.
Is the Jamaican company have a soft budget constraint, meaning that they get
No,
subsidized?
no, it's not subsidized.
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
just them missing out on
sentiment. Yeah,
opportunities.
missing out on opportunities because of sentiment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with everything that you said. I mean, it's all that's what we are in the business of studying. Markets are, we're not uh, economists are not pro business,
We're
right?
pro market.
Pro market, and the market process is a profit and loss system, and that means that resources have to be reallocated, that actors have to adapt and adjust to changes in taste, technology, and resource availability. And the key question is, what are the feedback loops that they face in making all of those? And yes, it's true that people have various different emotional biases, resentment being one of them, and envy, is another one. And those biases get in the way of us adapting and adjusting and moving forward with various different things. And as long as the market is open, people that hold on to those things are going to have to pay a price for those, right? They're going to have to pay a price for that in less profits and everything else that they go. And so that's the way that the market doesn't say it eliminates dysfunction. What it does is it says that you pay a price for dysfunction. So you would pay a price for discrimination. You'd pay a price for envy. You'd pay a price for resentment. It doesn't get rid of those things. It just makes sure that you have to pay a price. And following the laws of economics, there's a downward sloping demand curve for those things. So
Yes,
the higher the price you pay, the less you'll engage in them.
so and I would love to have Boris Gershman as a guest on the show. He has done wonderful work comparing constructive envy to destructive envy. Americans have constructive envy. Peter gets a PhD. John Brown wants to get a PhD and join Peter at GMU. Jamaicans are more on the destructive side. My friend is a management consultant. He studied abroad. And before I became more realistic, she would often say, even when some of our peers are highly educated, they cannot identify the good in other people. And as an older person, I now appreciate her sentiments.
Yeah.
Yes, I've read stories that are quite positive. Student gets 10 subjects, man is a PhD, and the comments are negative. They cannot appreciate the good in other people.
So explain the following to me then. How do they react to Usain Bolt?
Oh, I'm happy that you mentioned that point. In Jamaica, entertainers, athletes, and druggies are seen as legitimate entrepreneurs. Those people are allowed to make wealth. But if you're an entrepreneur or an intellectual, you're envied.
Yeah, that's
yeah, yes.
That's not unlike the U.S. as well. It's no one really gets upset with the amount of wealth that LeBron James has or Beyonce has or whatever, but they, would be very upset about a Wall Street trader, right? Just because they can't see, I guess, why it is that value is being created by that. These are age-old problems that you're, talking about. You mentioned about the Austrian school. The Austrian school and the scholars that migrated from Europe to the United States after, because of Hitler and whatnot. Among them, there's people like Helmut Schuck and others who wrote books about envy, and they tried to understand. Economics at the University of Vienna, economics was part of the law school. So the idea of a law in economics is embedded in all of the writings of Mises and Hayek and everyone else, von Bavarick, in a way that it wasn't in the Anglo-Saxon world, right? And so, so it makes sense. So people think when they think Hayek writing The Road to Serfdom or the Constitution of Liberty or Law, Legislation, and Liberty is Hayek leaving economics. But the reality is he's not leaving economics. He's addressing a different component of economics, mainly the institutional framework within which economic life takes place. And that's part of economics or part of political economy as well. And so, these issues that you're talking about, these behavioral regularities of, envy or resentment, those are very much part and parcel of what it is that we have to study. Yeah.
Yeah, so in Jamaica, it's a running joke. And the local term for envy in Jamaica is bad mind. And people joke about it, but it's actually quite serious.
Have you ever had Brian Kaplan on your show?
At some point, Brian will be on the show.
Yeah. So
Yes.
Brian Kaplan, in his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, talks about these various different biases that exist, in collective action. You should have him on because he would address this issue of yours that he's talking about. But the core idea of his book is that people hold on to those beliefs as long as they don't have to pay for them. If they're forced to where they have to pay for them, then they're going to hold on less to those beliefs if they don't conform to like a reality, that they're in there and that they're successful. But precisely because we're engaged in this kind of collective action, we're able to hide the true cost of holding on to these beliefs. And so that's what he means when he says, the whole issue about, rational irrationality.
Yeah, but before we wrap up my last 2 points.
Yeah.
Point number 1, Jamaica is characterized by high rates of necessity-driven entrepreneurship, not opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. According to the GEM, people in Jamaica form businesses to prevent earning the minimum wage. So again, it's a running joke. Jamaicans are entrepreneurial, but the truth is that our highly educated people are more likely to work for big businesses like in America, and entrepreneurs tend to be hustlers. It's a lifestyle business. They are not planned to become the next Google or the next Amazons. So from a policy perspective, it would be more feasible for the government to support high growth businesses and invest in R&D instead of giving money to hustlers who will eventually fail. So adopt the VC approach. And my question is, entrepreneurship a cause or consequence of development?
Well, I've argued that it is not that the cause of economic development is the security of property rights. And that what happens when you get the security of property rights, that individual entrepreneurs are able to then act on the issue of arbitrage to assure that the existing array of resources is utilized effectively, or discovery of new opportunities to push out the production possibility frontier. So entrepreneurship is both getting us on the production possibility frontier and pushing out the production possibility frontier. But the real issue is what gives rise to the entrepreneurial spirit, what gives rise to that. And that is a set of ideas and institutions which respect private property and the autonomy of the individual. And so going back to your point about individualism versus collectivism, there's an old paper by a friend of mine and former colleague, Avner Greif.
I would love to have him on the show.
On individualism versus collectivist, approaches. Another old colleague of mine and friend, David Harper, he wrote a book called The Mainsprings of Economic Progress. And what he does is he looks at psychological aptitudes of people and whether or not what they consider to be in the span of their control, like what's in their span of control rather than out of their control. And then that has an effect. So the more that you feel that you're in control of constructing your own life, the more you're entrepreneurial. But that's also correlated with being an individualist, that you believe you're the architect of your own life and that it's your projects and your pursuits which should be prioritized in your life. And so to me, I think that these things all do turn on the question that you were raising about individualism versus collectivism. If we find ourselves in a collectivist society, entrepreneurship is going to be necessity driven, as you just said, street trading, and things like that, swap markets and stuff, because people are always going to, but they're not going to be fixed investments and, and that kind of stuff, because they fear confiscation, they fear retribution, and whatnot. And so we need to work to make sure that we have a society that respects the fundamental rights of all of us and the fundamental dignity of each and every one of us, and our right to give it a go. So that's the key notion to trade tested development.
And I'm happy that you mentioned agency, because Jamaicans are not agentic. There's a tendency to ascribe failures to the government or the big man, who is usually a capitalist, but in the Jamaican sense, more than likely is a crony capitalist. But Peter, you should do some studies on Jamaica.
You know what? You made me interested. I might actually see if we got.
Yes, you should. Like, Jamaica is so interesting, but I don't see you bright guys writing more books.
Yeah, we should get on that one.
Yeah,
appreciate that.
Yeah, but before I go, this is my last point in relation to entrepreneurship and globalism. American companies are global. They're more global than the so-called Amazons of China. And I said to myself, in Jamaica, because of COVID, people are starting YouTube channels. One person, she's a bit famous. She started a YouTube channel and her focus is lifestyle and entertainment. So I said to myself, TikTok is popular. Why not interview TikTokers or American celebrities, because that's a larger market? So far, she has almost like 90,000 followers on YouTube. Maybe she's making money, but from a long-term perspective, it would be better for her to tap into the foreign market. So I said to my friend, why these people are not thinking globally? They're starting YouTube channels, they're giving jokes. One person that interviews people, he's a journalist, he could have started a podcast to interview local and international journalists. Why am I not seeing higher levels of globalism? So for example, I started this show and I'm interviewing you, I've interviewed Germans. So again, culture is important in the Jamaican framework. They start a YouTube program. I'm famous, I have 100,000 subscribers, but in the long term, it would be better to start a smaller channel, get outsiders like yourself and build an audience. So again, it's about future orientation of time. So as my friend is an investor, and she said, from a short-term perspective, the average Jamaican would not care about my show. But because she's a long-term investor, she would like it because Robin Dunbar was a guest. So it's in the grand scheme of things, it is better to have like 100 subscribers and interview Peter and Robin Dunbar than to have 100,000 subscribers and you're only interviewing people who are only popular in Jamaica.
Well, we hope that the internet is a vehicle not for siloing and an echo chamber, but that instead it can be used as a vehicle to bring ideas which otherwise wouldn't be on the table to be considered and weighed and measured and dismissed and adopted and adapted. And so hopefully, we're a conversation that's the first of many, and that, you'll get lots of different people thinking about these kind of issues and addressing them. My colleague, Virgil Storr, and my colleague, Ariel John, have a paper about entrepreneurship in Trinidad, which is similar to what you're talking about in Jamaica, in which it's a cultural impediment as opposed to a legal and political impediment. And, maybe we'll start to understand those forces a lot more the more we study them. And hopefully this is an invitation for people to study those and explore those options.
Yeah, and this show is an invitation to GMU. All of your economists can show up at any time. I don't have a problem doing a breakfast discussion. I love Jonathan Schultz. I just love all of you. This is like GMU's channel.
Yeah, you should definitely get Brian Kaplan on to talk about
but sure, to your students and to your colleagues, I'm willing to collaborate with GMU. You guys are just smart.
I will do.
Yeah, all right, bye.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity, and I wish you all the best.
All right, and right on Jamaica.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
All right.